The airport was buzzing with the usual activity of a busy afternoon. Travelers were rushing to and from their gates, announcements echoed in the background, and the scent of coffee filled the air. Among the bustling crowd, Sarah was heading to her gate for a flight when something caught her eye. A young boy, no older than 10, sitting alone in a corner by the window. He had a small toy car in his hands, and his eyes nervously scanned the terminal. Sarah couldn't help but notice how out of place he seemed. He wasn't with any parents or guardians, and there were no bags around him. His small frame made him appear even more vulnerable in the busy terminal. For a brief moment, Sarah debated whether to step in, but before she could think any further, 2 police officers appeared nearby, walking toward the boy. The officers, Harris and Willis, exchanged a glance as they approached. Sarah could feel the tension building. Officer Harris, tall and stern, looked at the boy with suspicion. "Where are your parents?" he asked, his voice firm. The boy looked up at them, startled. "I'm waiting for my mom," he said quietly. "Where's your mom?" Officer Willis pressed, his gaze narrowing. The boy's response was simple. "I don't know. She said to wait here." The officers stood still for a moment, clearly skeptical. Sarah, sensing the growing tension, stepped forward. "Is everything okay here?" she asked, her voice calm. Harris turned to her, sizing her up. "Who are you?" he asked. "I've seen him here before," Sarah explained. "He's just waiting for his mom. There's no need for all of this." Harris gave her a cold look, but said nothing. Instead, he motioned to Willis. "We need to check this out." Before Sarah could respond, a man in a sharp suit approached. He exuded authority, his presence demanding attention. The officers immediately froze. "I'm Frank Mitchell," the man said. "This is my son, Alex." Sarah's eyes widened. Frank Mitchell, the FAA Administrator, was a well-known figure in the aviation industry. The officers were now visibly embarrassed, realizing their mistake. "I'm sorry, sir," Harris stammered. "We thought—" Frank Mitchell didn't give him a chance to finish. He turned to his son and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "It's okay, Alex, let's go." The officers stood silently as the Mitchells walked away. Sarah watched them leave, feeling a mix of relief and unease. The officers had assumed the worst about a young black boy, only to realize too late that he was the son of someone far more powerful than they could have imagined. The silence that followed Frank Mitchell's arrival was thick, and for a moment, Officer Harris and his partner Willis were left standing in stunned embarrassment. The realization had hit them hard. They had made an enormous mistake, and the presence of Frank Mitchell, the FAA Administrator, was a clear reminder of the consequences their hasty judgment could have on a much larger scale. Sarah, still standing near the boy, felt a wave of discomfort as the officers silently processed their error. She had witnessed the entire situation unfold. The assumption that the boy, Alex, was a threat based solely on his race, the unnecessary questioning, the invasive attention he had received. It was clear that the officers had overstepped their bounds, but the bigger issue was that they had acted on their assumptions without considering the human cost. Frank Mitchell's voice broke the silence. "This is my son, Alex." His tone was calm, but his gaze was fixed on the officers, and there was no mistaking the authority behind his words. The shock on Harris's and Willis's faces was evident. They had no idea they were speaking to one of the most powerful figures in the aviation world. Alex, the young boy, was still standing frozen by his father's side. His eyes flicked nervously between the officers, but his father's reassuring presence seemed to settle his anxiety. "Dad?" Alex whispered, still unsure of what was happening. Frank knelt down to his son's level, placing a hand on his shoulder. "It's okay, Alex. These men just made a mistake." The officers were left scrambling for words. Harris cleared his throat. We thought the situation was suspicious." He trailed off, clearly uncomfortable. Frank stood up, his expression hardening. You thought? You judged my son based on what you saw. What exactly did you think was suspicious? Sarah watched as the officers fumbled to respond. Harris opened his mouth but quickly shut it as if realizing the weight of his actions. Finally, he muttered an apology. We're sorry, sir. We made an assumption based on the circumstances, but we should have approached this differently. Frank Mitchell didn't seem satisfied with the apology. This wasn't about the circumstances, he said, his voice steady but firm. This was about seeing a young black boy and assuming he was a threat. That's the problem, and you need to address it. Sarah stepped forward. She couldn't just let the situation pass without speaking up. This happens every day, she said, her voice sharp. It's not just about a few officers making mistakes. It's about a system that allows these assumptions to happen over and over. You're not just making a mistake about one boy. You're making a mistake about every black person you encounter. Frank Mitchell glanced at her, then nodded. She's right. This needs to change. And it starts with all of us recognizing that these biases exist, even in places we don't expect them. Alex, still holding on to his father's arm, looked up at him. Why did they think I was bad, Dad? Frank smiled softly, trying to reassure his son. They didn't know you, Alex. They made a mistake, but that doesn't mean they're bad people. But they need to learn not to judge others based on their skin color. Sarah stood silently, her eyes meeting the officers. It was evident that they were beginning to grasp the severity of their actions, but no apology could erase the harm that had been done, the prejudice that had been displayed so openly. Alex had been treated like a criminal without any reason, simply because of how he looked. Thank you for your understanding, Frank said, addressing the officers one last time, but I think we've all learned something here today. Without another word, Frank turned and walked away, Alex following closely beside him. The officers watched them go, their heads hung low in embarrassment. Sarah, still processing what had just happened, turned toward the boy's seat. She didn't know if the officers truly understood the weight of their mistake, but for now the damage was done. She had stepped in, but she couldn't help but wonder how many more instances like this were happening every day without any intervention. She watched as the father and son walked down the terminal, and as they disappeared from view, Sarah realized that this encounter was only the beginning of a much larger conversation, one that needed to be had, no matter how uncomfortable it was. The assumption, the prejudice, the racial profiling, it was all part of a bigger system, one that needed to be dismantled. The fight for justice didn't end with one apology. It would continue, and Sarah would make sure of it. The days that followed the confrontation in the terminal were filled with a sense of unease. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something more significant had just happened, but she couldn't fully process it until she sat down and reflected on the situation. The exchange between the officers and Frank Mitchell was troubling on so many levels, but it was also a stark reminder of the biases that were ingrained in society, biases that didn't simply disappear after a polite apology or a moment of reckoning. It wasn't just about the officer's mistake, it was about how they had reacted to the young boy, Alex, solely based on his appearance. To them, Alex wasn't just a child, he was a threat that needed to be addressed. Their perception of him had been clouded by the very biases they didn't even know they had. And that's what made the incident so devastating. Sarah spent the next few days speaking with friends and colleagues about the situation. Everyone agreed that the officers had made a grave mistake, but there was a deeper conversation to be had, a conversation about the larger societal issue that allowed these kinds of assumptions to take place. She couldn't help but think about how many other people, particularly black children and adults, had been subjected to the same treatment, the same scrutiny, the same unfair treatment. simply because of how they looked. How many times had it happened in airports, schools, stores, and workplaces? How many times had people been judged not for their actions, but for their skin color? For Sarah, this moment wasn't just about calling out the officers for their mistake. It was about challenging the system that allowed those biases to exist and persist. The system that made it easier for people to judge others based on stereotypes than to see them as individuals with their own stories, their own worth. As she reflected on the events of that day, Sarah realized that it wasn't enough for the officers to apologize. The situation needed to be used as a catalyst for change. If they truly wanted to make a difference, they would need to do more than just admit their mistake. They would need to actively work toward dismantling the racial prejudices that had influenced their actions. Sarah decided to take action. She began researching organizations that were working to combat racial profiling and discrimination. She reached out to civil rights groups and community leaders, all while planning how to make her voice heard. The officers might have learned their lesson in that moment, but there were others who needed to learn it too. There were others who needed to understand the impact of their biases and how they could change. But the more Sarah thought about it, the more she realized that change wouldn't come quickly. It wouldn't happen with a few apologies or a moment of reflection. It would take years of advocacy, education, and difficult conversations. It would take time for people to unlearn the prejudices that had been ingrained in them from a young age. But Sarah was determined to be part of that process. She had seen firsthand how dangerous assumptions could be, and she wasn't going to stay silent about it. In the following weeks, she worked alongside others who shared her commitment to fighting racial profiling. They organized town halls, spoke with community leaders, and worked to raise awareness about the realities of discrimination. Slowly but surely, their efforts began to gain traction. More and more people were willing to have the tough conversations about race, privilege, and systemic bias. As for the officers, their behavior didn't go unnoticed. The incident with Alex Mitchell was discussed in the local media, and while the officers tried to brush it off as a misunderstanding, the public wasn't so easily swayed. There was accountability to be had, and the officers would need to reckon with the reality of their actions. They would need to face the fact that their assumptions, their prejudices, had hurt a young child and his father, a father who just happened to be one of the most influential men in aviation. Frank Mitchell, meanwhile, used the incident as a springboard to push for more systemic change within the law enforcement community. He had spent years in positions of power, advocating for change from the top down. But now, as a father, he was personally invested in ensuring that his son, and children like him, didn't grow up in a world where their worth was ever questioned simply because of how they looked. For Sarah, the experience had been transformative. It had shaken her to her core, but it had also fueled her passion for justice. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but she was ready for the challenge. And as long as she had the strength to fight, she wouldn't stop advocating for change. The world needed to know that racism, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, could no longer be tolerated. The first step had been taken, but the journey had just begun. The days following the incident at the airport felt like a blur. Sarah couldn't shake the images of Alex and his father, Frank Mitchell, leaving the scene, the weight of their treatment lingering in the air. It wasn't just a mistake made by two officers. It was a reflection of a much larger issue, one that needed addressing. Sarah knew that the officers had apologized, but their remorse didn't change the fact that their assumptions had been based on racial prejudice. The damage had been done, and while the apology was a step, it wasn't enough. The truth was, systemic racism wasn't something that could be fixed with a few words. It was something that needed to be dismantled piece by piece through action. But where did she begin? She was just one person, and the road ahead seemed daunting. Yet the more Sarah thought about it, the more determined she became. This wasn't just about one mistake made by two officers. It was about an entire system that allowed these biases to exist unchecked. It was about the way people of color, especially black children, were treated with suspicion and distrust based on their skin color. Sarah knew she had to act, but she couldn't do it alone. She needed allies, and she needed to ensure that this incident wasn't just swept under the rug. She decided to reach out to a local civil rights organization that had been at the forefront of fighting racial profiling and discrimination. She explained the situation, hoping they would be as motivated to take action as she was. The response she received was swift. The organization's director, a passionate advocate for racial justice named Marcus, was immediately interested in getting involved. He had heard about the incident and was already aware of the public outcry surrounding it. But he wasn't content with just the media attention. He wanted to see real change. Together, Sarah and Marcus began to strategize. They knew that the first step was to bring more attention to the issue and to hold the officers and the department accountable for their actions. But they also recognized that this was part of a larger pattern. Racial profiling wasn't just happening at airports. It was happening in schools, on the streets, and in everyday encounters. Marcus suggested they start by hosting a community forum, a place where people could come together to share their experiences with racial profiling. It would give them the opportunity to hear firsthand accounts of what people were going through, and it would serve as a platform for raising awareness. The idea of the forum excited Sarah. She knew it wouldn't be easy, and that it would require a great deal of courage to stand up and speak out. But it was necessary. They needed to create a space where people felt safe enough to share their stories, where they could unite in their shared experiences and demand change. They set the date for the forum and began to spread the word. Sarah and Marcus reached out to local organizations, schools, and even businesses, encouraging people to attend. As the days passed, Sarah felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she knew that this was just the beginning. The night of the forum arrived, and the room quickly filled with people. Some were familiar faces, people who had seen the news and wanted to show their support. Others were strangers looking for a chance to have their voices heard. Sarah stood at the front, her heart racing. This was it, the moment she had been working toward. The event began with Sarah speaking briefly about the incident at the airport, setting the stage for the conversation. She explained how, in a moment of judgment, two officers had made a mistake based on assumptions, and how that moment had sparked a need for greater awareness and action. As she spoke, the room grew quiet. People listened intently, some nodding in agreement, others with their arms crossed, waiting to hear what came next. And then the stories began. A woman in the back stood up, her voice shaky but firm, as she recounted an experience she had at a grocery store where she had been followed by a store employee because of the color of her skin. A man in his 30s shared how he was stopped by the police for no reason, just because he was walking in a nice neighborhood. One by one, people stood and shared their experiences, each one adding weight to the discussion. The room was filled with emotion, the air thick with the truth of what so many people had gone through, often in silence. As the stories unfolded, Sarah could see the power of the moment. This was not just about her or the officers at the airport. This was about all of them, and about the systemic change that was needed to stop these biases from dictating people's lives. By the end of the night, the forum had done exactly what Sarah had hoped for. People were no longer just talking about the incident in the airport. They were talking about their own experiences, their own struggles with racism, and how they could work together to make a difference. But it wasn't over. This was just the beginning. The conversation had started, and now it was up to Sarah, Marcus, and everyone who had attended to keep pushing for change. They couldn't let the momentum die. The fight was only just beginning, but Sarah felt more determined than ever to see it through. The days after the forum were filled with a mix of emotions for Sarah. On one hand, she felt an overwhelming sense of accomplishment. The forum had been a success. People had come together, shared their stories, and started a conversation that was long overdue. But on the other hand, she couldn't ignore the pushback that was already beginning to surface. The conversation had started, but it was clear that not everyone was ready for the change that needed to come. The first signs of resistance came from some local businesses. Sarah had reached out to a few organizations and businesses in the area to spread the word about the forum and to gather support. Some were receptive, offering to help promote the event or to contribute in other ways. But others weren't so welcoming. One of the store owners Sarah had approached, a man named Jack, had initially agreed to be a part of the conversation. But after the forum, his tune changed. He called Sarah and told her in no uncertain terms that he didn't believe in making such a big deal out of something that had happened a long time ago. "It's not the way things are anymore," Jack had said, dismissing her concerns. "You're just stirring up trouble. People need to move on. It's a different world now." Sarah had been taken aback by his response. She tried to explain to him how systemic racism was still very much a present reality for many people, but Jack wasn't having it. He ended the conversation abruptly, leaving Sarah frustrated and disheartened. It wasn't the first time she'd encountered such resistance, and it wouldn't be the last. But each instance of pushback only fueled Sarah's determination. She had seen how necessary the conversation was, and she couldn't let people's discomfort stop her from pushing for change. Despite the obstacles, Sarah continued her work, reaching out to other organizations, setting up more community discussions, and amplifying the voices of those who had been marginalized. As time went on, more people began to open up to the idea of addressing racial issues head-on, but it was clear that change would take time. One evening, as Sarah was reviewing emails and preparing for another meeting, her phone rang. It was Frank Mitchell, the father of Alex, the young boy who had been mistaken for a threat at the airport. "I wanted to check in with you," Frank said, his voice steady but filled with an urgency that immediately caught Sarah's attention. "I've been hearing a lot about the work you've been doing, and I want to help." Frank's involvement brought a level of credibility to the movement that hadn't been there before. As the FAA Administrator, his influence could reach places that Sarah alone couldn't. He offered to use his position to push for systemic change, to work with law enforcement agencies, and to ensure that the conversation didn't fade away. "I know the resistance is tough," Frank continued, "but people like you and the people who shared their stories at the forum are the ones who are going to make the difference. It won't happen overnight, but we can't stop now." Sarah felt a surge of hope. With Frank's backing, the movement could gain more momentum, reach more people, and push for the changes that were desperately needed. It wasn't just about correcting the mistakes of a few officers. It was about making sure that this kind of bias didn't exist in the system to begin with. In the weeks that followed, Sarah and Frank worked together to organize workshops and discussions for local law enforcement, aimed at addressing racial profiling and the unconscious biases that often led to mistakes like the one with Alex. It was a slow process, and there were moments of frustration, but there was also a sense of progress. For Sarah, this journey had been more than just a call for justice. It had become a personal mission, one that was shaping the way she saw the world and the work that needed to be done. She had stepped up in a moment of injustice, but she knew the real work was only just beginning. As weeks passed, the movement gained traction, but the road to change was far from smooth. Sarah had started to see small victories, conversations happening, allies joining the cause. But the pushback was always just around the corner. Local news outlets began covering the workshops and discussions that Sarah had helped organize, and slowly, more and more people began to listen. Sarah had known that the road ahead would be challenging, but she hadn't anticipated just how deeply ingrained the resistance to change would be. Some law enforcement officials, despite attending the workshops, seemed to dismiss the gravity of the issue, treating the workshops as a formality rather than an opportunity for growth. The most frustrating part was the realization that systemic racism wasn't something that could be eradicated with a single training session or an apology. It would take years, decades of continuous effort to truly dismantle the biases that had been woven into the fabric of society. Despite the challenges, Sarah found strength in the community that was growing around her. More and more people came forward to share their stories of racial profiling, discrimination, and the everyday battles faced by people of color. These stories weren't just powerful, they were a testament to the resilience of a community that had endured for far too long. The turning point came when Frank Mitchell took matters into his own hands. Having witnessed firsthand how even well-intentioned efforts could be dismissed by those in power, Frank reached out to his colleagues in the higher echelons of government and law enforcement. With his clout and position, Frank was able to initiate more serious conversations about police reform, pushing for structural changes that would make it harder for implicit biases to go unchecked. He pushed for changes in training, for stronger accountability measures for officers who violated the public's trust, and for deeper transparency in how police departments interacted with minority communities. The meetings were long and often contentious, but with Frank's guidance, progress was being made. People who had once been complacent in maintaining the status quo were beginning to listen, and more importantly, they were beginning to understand the importance of taking action. Meanwhile, Sarah continued to lead the charge at the grassroots level, organizing more forums and engaging with local schools, businesses, and organizations. She knew that real change couldn't just come from the top down. It had to be a collective effort from all sides. She worked tirelessly to ensure that the voices of those most affected by racial bias were being heard and respected. The growing unity among community leaders, activists, and even some law enforcement members who were genuinely committed to the cause was beginning to create real momentum. The discussions, once dominated by skepticism and resistance, had now shifted to an open dialogue about solutions. Law enforcement agencies were beginning to recognize that their relationship with the community needed to change, and that understanding rather than suspicion needed to be at the forefront of their interactions with people of color. However, the work was far from over. Every victory brought with it new challenges, and each step forward was met with resistance from those who preferred the comfort of the old system. There were still battles to be fought, still minds to change, and still a long road ahead. But Sarah felt something she hadn't felt before: hope. She had seen how far they had come, and more importantly, she had seen how far they could go. The movement had grown beyond one incident, one forum, or even one community. It had become a force, and its ripple effects were starting to spread. In a quiet moment, Sarah sat at her desk, her phone buzzing with notifications about upcoming events and new messages of support. She glanced over at a framed photo on her desk, a picture of her with her family, smiling and happy. Her mind drifted to her own children and the future they would inherit. She didn't want them to grow up in a world where they would be treated differently because of their skin color. She wanted to leave them a legacy of change, a world where people were judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. It was a long road ahead, but for the first time, Sarah felt that they were on the right path. The next few months were a whirlwind for Sarah. What had begun as a single forum in a local community center had rapidly transformed into a movement with national implications. More and more people, from various walks of life, were coming forward to share their stories, their struggles, and their hopes for change. The momentum Sarah had hoped for was beginning to take shape, and the impact was undeniable. Frank Mitchell's involvement had certainly amplified the movement, but it wasn't just his position that made the difference. It was his genuine commitment to seeing the system change. He had leveraged his connections within the government to push for police reforms, working tirelessly with officials and community leaders to draft legislation that would address systemic racism in law enforcement. Frank had quickly become a powerful voice in the push for justice, and his influence had catalyzed some much-needed changes at the highest levels. Sarah, on the other hand, was still working at the grassroots level. She organized rallies, educational workshops, and continued to advocate for the voices of those who had been silenced for far too long. Slowly but surely, their efforts began to bear fruit. Some local police departments began adopting new, more comprehensive training programs. Community leaders were collaborating with law enforcement to address the deep-rooted issues that had existed for generations, and while it wasn't a perfect solution, it was progress. One afternoon, as Sarah sat in a cafe reviewing some documents, she received a call from Marcus. His voice was filled with energy. "Sarah," he said excitedly, "you're not going to believe this. I just spoke with the mayor's office. They want to meet with us." The mayor's office. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. This was it. The recognition they needed was finally here. For months, she had worked tirelessly, hoping for a moment like this, where their voices would be heard by those in power. "That's amazing," Sarah replied, her voice trembling with anticipation. "When?" "Tomorrow. They want us to present our case to the city council. The mayor is ready to take action." For Sarah, this meeting felt like the culmination of everything they had been working toward. She was ready. She knew that this was her chance to speak directly to the people who could make real, lasting change. The next day, Sarah and Marcus arrived at City Hall, a mix of nerves and excitement pulsing through them. The room was packed, and the air was thick with tension. This was more than just a meeting. It was an opportunity to change the way their community and potentially the country viewed racial bias in law enforcement. Sarah stepped up to the podium, her hands slightly shaking as she adjusted the microphone. She took a deep breath and looked out at the sea of faces in front of her. There were police officers, community leaders, business owners, and elected officials. This was her moment. "Thank you for having us today," she began, her voice clear and steady. "We've been fighting for justice for far too long, but we're here now and we're asking for a change that's long overdue." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle in. The room fell silent. "We've seen firsthand the effects of racial profiling and discrimination. We've heard the stories, we've listened to the pain, and now it's time for action." Sarah spoke passionately about the forum they had organized, the voices of the community, and the systemic problems that continued to plague society. She talked about the incident with Alex Mitchell and how that moment had highlighted the deeply ingrained biases in their system. But she didn't stop there. She offered solutions. "We need new training programs that don't just acknowledge racial bias, but actively combat it," she said. "We need community oversight to ensure transparency and accountability, and we need policies that protect those who are most vulnerable, not just those in power." As Sarah spoke, she could see the impact of her words. Some of the officials nodded, their expressions changing from skepticism to consideration. Others looked uncomfortable, but Sarah pressed on. "This isn't just about changing laws," she said, her voice unwavering. "It's about changing hearts and minds. It's about building a community where everyone feels safe, no matter the color of their skin. When Sarah finished speaking, there was a long silence. Then, one by one, the council members began to speak, each offering their thoughts on how they could support the cause. Some were hesitant, but many agreed that change was needed. By the end of the meeting, Sarah had secured a commitment for further discussions on police reform and racial justice. It wasn't everything she had hoped for, but it was a start. As Sarah walked out of City Hall, Marcus by her side, she felt a sense of accomplishment. The fight was far from over, but they had taken a major step toward making the change they wanted to see. It wasn't just about the meeting, it was about the conversation that was now happening. And that, Sarah knew, was the first step toward real transformation. Not everyone was as enthusiastic about the progress Sarah had helped initiate. While the community rallied behind the movement, there were those who resisted the call for change. The City Hall meeting had been a turning point, but it didn't take long for Sarah to realize that there would be no easy path ahead. The very next day after the meeting, Sarah received an unexpected phone call. It was from her colleague Jenna, a fellow activist who had been helping organize the forums and discussions. "You won't believe this," Jenna said, her voice tinged with disbelief. "There's a petition going around. People are calling for a halt to all these changes. They're saying it's going too far." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. She had known there would be resistance, but seeing it play out so quickly was jarring. "What do you mean, halt the changes?" Sarah asked, her voice betraying her frustration. Jenna sighed. "People are starting to feel uncomfortable. Some local business owners, even a few police officers, feel like the conversation is getting too heavy. They're saying the community is being divided." Sarah couldn't believe what she was hearing. After everything that had been done, the months of effort, the forum, the discussions, the idea that the community was now actively trying to shut down their progress was disheartening. "They don't want change," Jenna continued. "They want everything to stay the same, and they're using the petition as leverage. They think if they make enough noise, the city council will back down." The weight of Jenna's words settled heavily on Sarah's shoulders. She had anticipated some pushback, but she hadn't expected the backlash to come so quickly or so forcefully. The system was resisting, and it wasn't going to give up without a fight. Sarah knew that this was going to be a test of her resolve. She had come so far, and now she had to decide whether she was going to let this backlash derail everything they had worked for. The petition was being circulated among local businesses, and soon Sarah began to see it pop up in local news outlets, with some prominent figures publicly voicing their opposition. There were claims that the push for police reform and racial justice was dividing the community and spreading unnecessary tension. Some people argued that the accusations of racial profiling were exaggerated, while others claimed that the reforms would hurt local businesses and cost taxpayers money. It didn't take long for Sarah to realize that these voices of dissent were not just individuals. They were part of a larger network of people invested in maintaining the status quo. People who were uncomfortable with change, even if that change was necessary. But Sarah wasn't one to back down easily. She knew what was at stake, and she couldn't let this resistance stop her from continuing the fight. She called Marcus, and together they began organizing counteractions. "We need to get in front of this," Marcus said, his voice full of determination. "We can't let the opposition dominate the conversation. We need to show them that the majority of people are in favor of change." Sarah agreed. "I'll keep reaching out to the community. We have to show them how important this is, and we can't let them push us back into silence." In the days that followed, Sarah and Marcus worked tirelessly to rally supporters. They organized additional forums, created petitions for people who stood behind the movement, and pushed the conversation forward with as much energy as they could muster. Despite the negative pushback, Sarah started to see something that fueled her optimism. People who had once been silent were now speaking out. Some of the business owners who had initially been hesitant began to shift their stance, acknowledging that the conversation was necessary. Even some law enforcement officers came forward, expressing a desire to learn and do better. But it was still an uphill battle. The resistance was loud and the negativity was suffocating. People were afraid of what the changes might mean for their businesses, for their livelihoods, and for the status quo that had been so comfortable for so long. Sarah couldn't afford to back down. Every day she reminded herself that this was bigger than one petition, bigger than one protest. This was about dismantling a system that had been broken for too long. The opposition didn't scare her. It only made her more determined to fight. As Sarah sat at her desk late one evening, reviewing the latest developments, she knew this was only the beginning. The battle wasn't over yet, but she also knew that every step forward, no matter how small, was one step closer to the change they were fighting for, and that kept her moving forward. The pressure was mounting, but so was the resolve of those determined to see change. Sarah had always known that the road to justice wouldn't be easy, but the more she fought, the more she realized how many people truly cared about this cause. And with the growing opposition, she needed to find a way to keep the momentum going. It was a Friday afternoon when Sarah received an unexpected phone call. The number on the screen wasn't familiar, but the voice on the other end was unmistakable. Sarah? It was Frank Mitchell, the FAA Administrator. His tone was calm but determined. "Yes, Frank, what's going on?" Sarah asked, already bracing for whatever news he had. "I've been following everything closely," Frank said, "and I think it's time we escalate this conversation. I've spoken with a few people in the administration, and I think we can bring this discussion to the national stage." Sarah felt a surge of hope. "What do you mean?" "I'm talking about holding a national forum on police reform and racial profiling. We've got the resources, the connections, and the platform to make this issue a priority on a federal level. This is bigger than just the local community." It was an idea that filled Sarah with both excitement and apprehension. A national forum. It was an opportunity to elevate the movement beyond the city, beyond the local struggles, and into a broader conversation. It was a chance to address racial profiling and police reform on a scale that could have far-reaching effects. "But we've got opposition here, Frank," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the growing excitement. "There are people who are actively trying to stop this movement. I don't know how well it will be received on a national level." Frank's voice was unwavering. "We've got the support of the right people. If we're going to make a real impact, we need to take this to the top. It won't be easy, but I believe it's the right step." Sarah took a deep breath, weighing the implications of the conversation. A national forum meant opening up the issue to a much wider audience, one that included political leaders, law enforcement officials, and perhaps even the public in a way they hadn't been exposed to before. It would be a challenge, but it was a challenge she felt ready for. "I'm in," she said. "Let's do this." In the days that followed, the groundwork for the National Forum was quickly set in motion. Frank used his connections within the federal government to gather influential figures from various sectors: law enforcement, civil rights organizations, and political leaders. Sarah worked behind the scenes, organizing speakers, crafting the agenda, and ensuring that the voices of those most affected by racial profiling would be at the forefront of the conversation. As the date of the forum drew closer, Sarah could feel the weight of what was about to happen. This was bigger than any forum or rally she had attended before. This wasn't just about local change. This was about creating a shift in the national dialogue around race and law enforcement. It wasn't going to be easy, But Sarah was no longer afraid of the fight. She had seen how powerful the collective voice could be, and she knew that with Frank's support, they could bring this issue to the forefront of national politics. The week before the forum, Sarah received another call. This time, it was from Marcus, her ally in the movement. "I've been hearing a lot of talk," Marcus said. "People are starting to pay attention. I know we've faced resistance, but it seems like we're gaining ground. The forum is going to be a turning point." Sarah smiled, feeling the truth of his words sink in. "It's just the beginning, Marcus. This is the kind of change that takes time, but it's happening." The stage was set, and Sarah couldn't help but feel a rush of determination. She was ready to face the challenges that lay ahead. The movement was growing, and now they had the chance to make their voices heard on a national scale. The fight was far from over, but Sarah was more confident than ever that they were on the right path. The day of the National Forum arrived with a weighty sense of anticipation. It was being held in Washington, D.C., in one of the most prestigious venues in the country. The forum, which had been months in the making, was now a reality. The room was filled with prominent leaders from all walks of life: law enforcement officers, civil rights activists, political leaders, and members of the press. Sarah felt the gravity of the moment settle on her shoulders as she looked around the room, but she also felt a surge of determination. This was the platform she had worked so hard to create. Frank Mitchell stood beside her, his presence adding an air of authority to the event. The two had spent countless hours preparing for this day, strategizing how to present the issue of racial profiling and police reform in a way that would spark meaningful change. The audience grew quiet as Frank stepped to the podium. His voice, calm and composed, filled the room. "We are here today to discuss a topic that has plagued this country for far too long. Racial profiling," Frank began, his gaze sweeping the room. "For generations, people of color, particularly black individuals, have been unfairly targeted, mistreated, and criminalized simply because of the color of their skin. This is not an issue of individual mistakes. This is a systemic problem that demands immediate action." Frank's words were met with a mix of nods and silence. Sarah watched from the side of the room, feeling the power of the moment wash over her. The stage was set, and now the conversation was about to begin. After Frank's opening remarks, Sarah took the stage. She looked out at the crowd, feeling the weight of their gaze, but also the power of her voice. She knew that this forum wasn't just about presenting a case for reform. It was about showing people, especially those in positions of power, that the change had to start now. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice steady but passionate. As Frank said, this is not an issue of individual mistakes. It's a systemic issue that has harmed millions of people over the years. It's time to confront it head on. Sarah spoke about her experiences, how she had seen firsthand the way racial profiling and implicit bias had affected communities across the country. She talked about the painful incidents she had witnessed, including the one involving Alex Mitchell, the young boy who had been unjustly targeted at the airport. She explained how, in that moment, she had seen the harm that assumptions could cause. But she also spoke about the importance of hope, of pushing for change, even when the road seemed impossible. "This isn't just about changing laws," Sarah said, her voice growing stronger. "This is about changing hearts and minds. This is about creating a society where no one, no matter their race or background, has to fear being treated unfairly. This is about justice." The room fell silent. Sarah felt the weight of her words hanging in the air. This was her moment, and she wasn't backing down. She wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for every individual who had ever felt the sting of racial profiling, for every person who had been made to feel less than because of the color of their skin. The conversation that followed was intense, filled with passionate discussions about the policies and reforms that needed to be put in place. Some of the law enforcement officials were resistant, trying to justify their methods, while others were more open to change. But even in the face of resistance, Sarah stayed firm in her convictions. This was a conversation that needed to happen. And it was happening. As the day came to a close, the forum ended with a sense of resolution. Though no immediate action had been taken, there was a clear understanding that the dialogue had begun. The momentum was building, and people were beginning to recognize that the fight for racial justice was not just necessary, it was urgent. For Sarah, the forum was a moment of reckoning, not just for the country but for herself. She had started as one person, a mother who had seen the injustices around her and decided to act. Now she was part of something much bigger, a movement for change that was growing stronger every day. The road ahead was still uncertain, but Sarah knew one thing for sure. This was just the beginning. The day after the National Forum, Sarah found herself caught in the aftermath of what had been a pivotal moment in the national conversation on racial justice. The response from the system was mixed. Some lawmakers and law enforcement officials pledged their support for reforms, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the conversation had just scratched the surface. While the forum had garnered significant media attention and had even been deemed a success by many, there was still a palpable resistance. Sarah knew that many of the promises made by politicians were just words. Action was what was needed. A few politicians seemed genuinely interested in making changes, but most were only interested in placating the public to avoid further scrutiny. Sarah continued to work closely with Frank Mitchell, using his position to push for legislative reform. They met with government officials, wrote letters, and held press conferences, but the battle for meaningful change felt like it was never truly gaining the traction it needed. The resistance was strongest from the law enforcement community. While some officers admitted the necessity of change, many more seemed to view the discussions about police reform as an attack on their authority. There were whispers among them that the momentum Sarah had generated was simply a passing phase, an inconvenience that would eventually fade. Some officers even attempted to discredit the movement by claiming it was based on one isolated incident that didn't represent the larger picture. Sarah spent sleepless nights, wondering if they would make any real progress. Every time she got a step closer, it felt like the system pushed back even harder. In a particularly disheartening meeting with some high-ranking law enforcement officials, she was told that police work wasn't something to be dictated by public opinion. For Sarah, this was a breaking point. The realization hit her that the battle would not be won in a single forum or a series of workshops. It would take years of persistent effort, but even more than that, it would take public pressure from all sides. She understood now that reform was not something that could be accomplished overnight. The system was deeply entrenched, and the forces holding it in place were formidable. Despite the resistance, Sarah knew they couldn't stop. The movement had sparked a fire, and now the flames of change had spread far beyond the initial forum. People across the country were beginning to talk about the issues they had ignored for so long. Grassroots organizations, activists, and even some law enforcement officers had begun questioning their own roles in perpetuating the system. Sarah realized that change wouldn't come solely from politicians and government officials. It would come from the people. It would come from community members who had the courage to stand up and say that they had had enough. It would come from a collective will to dismantle the biases that had been built over centuries. So Sarah continued to push forward. The meetings, the protests, the forums, they all became part of the ongoing battle. She knew there would be setbacks, but she also knew that every setback was followed by a lesson learned. The fight for racial justice was no longer just about a single issue. It was about addressing the deep inequalities that had been ignored for too long. The story wasn't over, and it wouldn't be for a long time. But as Sarah stood at the front of yet another meeting, preparing to continue the fight, she understood one thing. The battle for justice had only just begun. She had no intention of backing down. The more Sarah pushed for change, the more she began to realize the personal cost of her activism. It wasn't just the sleepless nights, the constant juggling of meetings and family obligations, or the growing public scrutiny. There was something deeper at play, the toll that the fight for justice was taking on her emotional and mental health. The constant exposure to stories of pain and injustice weighed heavily on Sarah. Every new encounter, every story shared in a forum or by an anonymous tipster seemed to deepen the anger and frustration that had been building since the airport incident. She found herself feeling exhausted in ways she hadn't expected. Her friends and family had seen the change in her, a constant restlessness, an ever-present tension in her posture, a growing sense of hopelessness whenever she encountered resistance. One evening, after a particularly draining meeting with local law enforcement officials, Sarah sat in her living room, her mind clouded with doubt. Frank Mitchell's words echoed in her ears. This isn't going to be easy. She knew that, but she hadn't anticipated just how much this fight would take from her personally. Her children, once her source of joy and comfort, seemed more distant to her now. She was often too consumed by the movement, too immersed in the need to keep pushing forward, to give them the attention they needed. The guilt that she wasn't present enough for them gnawed at her. In the middle of it all, her marriage to David was also beginning to show signs of strain. He was supportive, yes, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was leaving him behind. He had always been there for her, but now, when he needed her, she felt distant. There were days when they barely exchanged more than a few words, when he would ask about her day, only for Sarah to brush him off with a distracted answer. David had always been patient, understanding of her drive and determination, but even his patience had limits. One night, after Sarah came home late from another rally, David gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "You've been at this for months, Sarah," he said softly. "I get it. You're doing important work. But we need you, too. Your family needs you." His words, though kind, felt like a knife to the heart. Sarah hadn't realized how much she had withdrawn from her loved ones, and the realization hit her harder than she expected. She had been so consumed by the fight for justice that she had neglected the very people who had always been by her side. "I'm sorry, David," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to balance it all. This fight is everything to me, but I don't want to lose you. I don't want to lose us." David held her in silence for a moment. "You won't lose us, Sarah. But you have to remember you're not alone in this. You don't have to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders." Sarah nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. She had always been the one to lead the charge, to take responsibility for everything. But now, standing there in the quiet of her living room, she realized that she didn't have to do it alone. She had a family, a community, a movement that was growing stronger by the day. It was time for her to let go of the idea that she could do it all by herself. But even with the support of those around her, the personal sacrifices remained. She had already given so much, and there were moments when she wondered if the fight was worth it. The emotional toll was taking its toll on her mental health, and she needed to find a way to balance the fight for justice with her own well-being. In the days that followed, Sarah worked to find that balance. She started taking time for herself again, stepping away from the movement for short breaks, reconnecting with her children, and spending more time with David. She realized that she needed to be strong, not just for the movement, but for the people who relied on her. But the fight was far from over, and Sarah knew that the battle would continue. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about all the people who had been silenced for too long. As long as she could, she would keep pushing forward no matter the cost. The price of justice was high, but Sarah was determined to see it through. Sarah sat in her office, a mixture of exhaustion and satisfaction weighing heavily on her. The work was never-ending, but the progress was undeniable. The National Forum had been a success, and slowly she had started to see the changes she had hoped for. But the fight was far from over. As the months passed, Sarah found herself balancing more responsibilities. The forums, the community outreach, the meetings with officials, everything was beginning to take a toll on her personal life. Despite the victories, the battle against systemic racism seemed endless. Every step forward was met with resistance, and every piece of progress felt like a small victory in a much larger war. The new laws and reforms that had begun to take shape were just the beginning. Sarah knew that the real challenge lay in the implementation of these changes. It was one thing to sign a bill into law, but it was another to make sure that those laws were enforced, that the system could be transformed from the inside out. She had seen firsthand how deeply entrenched these issues were, and she knew that real change couldn't happen overnight. One afternoon, as Sarah prepared for another meeting, her phone rang. It was Frank Mitchell. "Sarah," Frank began, his voice steady, "I wanted to update you on the progress we've made at the federal level. There's been some pushback, but we're pushing through. We've got more allies now, and the reforms are gaining momentum." Sarah listened intently, grateful for Frank's support. Over the past few months, his involvement had made a huge difference, and together they had managed to bring the issue of racial profiling to the national stage. But Sarah knew that the real battle was still ahead of them. "Good to hear," she replied, her voice filled with determination. "We've come a long way, but we need to keep pushing. This isn't over." Frank agreed. "We've got a long road ahead, but we're not backing down." As Sarah hung up the phone, she took a moment to reflect on how far they had come. She had started this journey out of frustration and anger, but now she saw the change beginning to take root. There were still challenges, still people who resisted, but the movement was growing stronger, more unified. One of the most rewarding aspects of the past few months had been seeing the younger generation step up. Sarah had always believed that the fight for justice was about more than just individual victories. It was about leaving a legacy for future generations. She had watched as young people, particularly teenagers and college students, began to lead the charge, organizing their own events and pushing for change in their communities. Sarah had always known that the fight for racial justice wouldn't be quick or easy, but with each new voice added to the conversation, each new person who decided to stand up and speak out, she felt more hopeful. The tide was turning, slowly but surely. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the community, the movement, and the future they were building together. The work ahead would be difficult, and there would undoubtedly be setbacks. But Sarah had seen the power of perseverance, the strength of collective action. She knew that the fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. As she sat back in her chair, a quiet sense of peace washed over her. The road ahead was long, but it was a road she was ready to walk. Months passed, and the work Sarah had started continued to ripple out, affecting more communities, more lives, and more systems. The National Forum had been just one step in a journey that felt more like a marathon than a sprint. But as Sarah stood before a new group, the meetings had become less about convincing people of the problem and more about finding concrete solutions. The movement had gained enough momentum that even the most reluctant participants in the conversation were now showing up, eager to understand how they could be part of the change. Policymakers who had once dismissed the issue as one of individual bias were now on board with national legislation focused on racial equality. One of the most significant achievements was the passing of the national law, requiring anti-bias training for law enforcement officers at all levels. It wasn't perfect, no piece of legislation ever is, but it was a start. Sarah had worked relentlessly with Frank and other activists to ensure that the voices of those most impacted by racial bias were heard loud and clear in the process. But even more rewarding was the shift in the communities. Across the country, people of all ages were joining the cause. Sarah had seen how young people were taking the reins in local activism, holding their own forums, demanding reform in schools, and creating spaces for open conversations about race. It wasn't just about police reform anymore. It was about dismantling the systems that had allowed racism to persist in every aspect of society. One day, Sarah stood in front of a crowd at a school rally, a sea of faces, young and old, black and white, staring up at her with hope. These weren't just children in a classroom. These were the future leaders, advocates, and change makers. Sarah paused for a moment, her heart swelling with pride. This was the vision she had hoped for, a movement not just built by one person, but by an entire generation. "Look at this room," she said, her voice filled with conviction. "This is the future we've been fighting for. This is the change we've been pushing for. It's not just about us anymore, it's about all of you. Together we will make this world a place where equality is the rule, not the exception." Her words rang in the air, and for the first time, she truly believed them. The world was changing. It wasn't just a dream. The road had been long and the fight had been hard. But Sarah knew that they had reached a critical juncture in history. What they had started would continue long after they were gone. Sarah's phone buzzed with a message from Frank. It was a simple message, one that she had received countless times before, but now it felt different. "Thank you for everything. We've made history today." And it was true. Together they had made history, but it wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The work would continue, and Sarah knew that she, and everyone who had joined her along the way, would keep fighting until the world was as it should be, a world where no one was judged by the color of their skin. The struggle had brought them together, and now it was their unity that would carry the movement forward long into the future. As Sarah stepped off the stage that day, she realized that the victory wasn't just in the laws passed or the policies changed. It was in the hearts and minds of the people who had stood with her. It was in the thousands of voices calling for justice, equality, and understanding. And as she looked out at the crowd one last time, she knew without a doubt that they had truly made a difference.